Anyone who attended a concert by pianist Cecil Taylor between the 1970s and his final public appearance at New York's Whitney Museum in 2016 was likely to experience not just an evening of breathtaking high-level modern music — the word jazz is inadequate, though that was certainly his foundation — but a multidisciplinary spectacle that encompassed music, dance, and poetry. Taylor's lifelong interest in all three of these areas allowed him to combine them in ways different from any other performer or composer of his era. He collaborated with choreographers, brought dancers on stage with his bands, and sometimes danced onto and around the stage himself before sitting down at the piano. He wrote and sometimes read poetry, either as a prelude to a concert or in the middle of it. And on multiple occasions, he included his poems in his album's packaging, not necessarily as liner notes as they are commonly understood, but as a companion to the music, adding a dimension to it and giving the listener something to think about long after the final notes had died away. Taylor, born in Queens, studied at the New England Conservatory in Boston, where he made important professional connections and witnessed performances by jazz legends that stayed with him for the rest of his life. When he returned to New York, he quickly earned a reputation as a challenging performer whose lengthy sets were not exactly conducive to selling drinks and turning over tables in nightclubs. But he was more than just one more struggling young musician. He was a part of New York's broader avant-garde art scene, mingling with the painters and poets who visited the Five Spot Cafe, where his group was the first entertainment booked, and other now legendary spots. Taylor was for several years a close associate of Leroy Jones, who introduced him to fellow poets like Frank O'Hara and Allen Ginsberg. In a 1989 interview, Ginsberg recalled a party at Jones' Greenwich Village apartment. 3 blocks away from here on 14th Street, I saw at one party, in one room, at one time, Langston Hughes, Don Cherry, Ornette Coleman, Cecil Taylor, Franz Klein, Kerouac, myself, Peter Orlovsky, Gregory Corso, A.B. Spellman, other blacks that I didn't know at the time, Frank O'Hara, maybe Frank's friends, Larry Rivers and Arnold Weinstein, maybe intersecting with Kenneth Koch, John Ashbery, and others, Robert Creeley, Charles Olson. Olson wasn't there until Creeley was around New York. Similarly, Diane de Prima, another poet on the scene at the time, recalled the constant flow of human traffic from one place to another, everyone engaged in what could feel like a single unending conversation and exchange of ideas. There was no night when you weren't at a movie or seeing someone's new dance or going to a rehearsal of a dance you were in, rehearsing for Poets Theater. The amount of input was huge. Cecil would say, "Do you want to come over? I want to practice all afternoon." And I wasn't going to come in and chat or anything. I was going to come over with my notebook and scribble. A particularly powerful influence on Taylor as a young artist was Bob Kaufman, a black poet connected with the Beats. "One night, boy, I was at this building that was on First Avenue and First Street," Taylor said to writer Chris Funkhauser in a 1994 interview. "It was a sort of triangular-shaped building, and Ginsberg, Orlovsky, Leroy Jones, and Kaufman and myself were in this room. And I just stood there, and there was no question in my mind who the force was in that room." He was like a spirit, Taylor continued. So finally, when I met him, he came to the 5 Spot one night I was working there, said, "You've got to come with me after you finish work." I said, "Look, Bob, I started working at 9:15. I won't be finished until 4 o'clock. I can't do this." So he said, "Yes, you will." And he came at 4 o'clock, and he took me over to what is now Soho, and he read poems to me until about 1:15 the next afternoon. and I remember walking out of that loft completely energized. I hate that word, but completely transformed. Taylor and Leroy Jones had a combustible relationship. Jazz critic Robert Levin, a friend of Taylor's, said, "In the early period, Cecil was very taken with Baraka's poetry, and he admired Baraka, or Leroy Jones at the time, in a lot of ways. But they also didn't quite trust each other, or at least Cecil didn't trust Roy. Roy was not, as Archie Shepp told me point blank, a nice man." I think Cecil had an ambivalent relationship with Roy, but I think he cared about Roy. I mean, he acknowledged Roy as a heavyweight by his standards. But A.B. Spellman was part of that group too, and Roy had savaged A.B.'s poetry at some point, and A.B. had actually stopped writing for a while, and Cecil was protective of A.B. with respect to what Roy did to A.B. So there was, as I say, a distrust, but I think he did admire his talents. Distrustful or not, Taylor and Jones worked together on multiple projects, which helped to foster the pianist's growing interest in poetry. Jones and DePrima, who had a child together though he was still married to his first wife, Hetty Jones, launched a newsletter called The Floating Bear in February 1961. Distributed by mailing list, the newsletter published more or less monthly. Issues would be assembled with help from friends. In DePrima's recollection, whole bunches of people would come over to help. Painters, musicians, a whole lot of outside help. The typing was done by James Waring, who's a choreographer and painter. Cecil Taylor ran the mimeograph machine, and dancer and choreographer Fred Herco and I collated, and we all addressed envelopes. Taylor was unwilling to affiliate himself completely with the Greenwich Village poetry crowd, though. Levin said, "I remember it was during the early 60s that Allen Ginsberg wanted him to do the music for Howl, and Cecil refused, and he was always very cryptic about it in his answers when I would ask him why. But I came to understand that he didn't want to be associated with the beats. He liked some of them, admired some of them, but didn't want to be a beat pianist. He wanted to be Cecil Taylor, and wanted to keep his music separate and discreet." Taylor's early albums, from his 1956 debut Jazz Advance through the 1962 recordings variously released as Live at the Café Montmartre and Nefertiti, The Beautiful One Has Come, had conventional liner notes. They were written at the behest of whatever label was putting the record out, and consisted of essays by prominent critics who would interview Taylor about the music and offer observations of their own. In 1966, Taylor signed with Blue Note Records. He would make 2 albums that year, Unit Structures and Conquistador. Unit Structures featured his regular group of the time with alto saxophonist Jimmy Lyons, bassist Henry Grimes, and drummer Andrew Cyrille. But the ensemble also included trumpeter Eddie Gale, Ken McIntyre on multiple reeds, and a second bassist, Alan Silva. The music was intensely complicated and required a great deal from the players. Alan Silva said, "Unit Structures is one of the greatest realizations of Cecil's notational concept. Yes, there's a score. Nobody plays unit structure in a jam session. That album took us 4 months of rehearsal. We had to learn the music. Me, Eddie Gale, Ken McIntyre, Jimmy, Andrew, and Henry." The liner notes to Unit Structures were not written by a critic. Instead, the album included a nearly 2,000-word Taylor essay, Sound Structure of Subculture Becoming Major Breath / Naked Fire Gesture, written as a kind of prose poem. It explored his creative philosophy and compositional approach through dense thickets of metaphor, but when you read it slowly and carefully, it provides multiple keys to understanding his music. Taylor was at this time fixated on the idea of the anacrusis, a note or sequence of notes that precedes the first downbeat in a musical phrase. It serves as a short introduction and can create a mood or set expectations. In his essay, he writes, "From anacrusis to plane, patterns and possibility converge, mountainsides to dry rock beds, a fountain spread before prairie. Form is possibility. Content, quality, and change growth in addition to direction found. Third part is area where intuition and given material mix group interaction. Simultaneous invention heard which these words describe. Later he writes, measurement of sound is its silences, acknowledging silence its definition in absence. Still later, he expresses some core tenets of his approach to music making. He writes, at the controlled body center, motors become knowledge at once felt, memory which has identified sensory images resulting social response. Practice is speech to oneself out of that self-metamorphosizing life's act, a musical symbol having become which that has placement in creation language is arrived at. Western notation blocks total absorption in the action playing. This was a fundamental principle for Taylor. As he explained to journalist Valerie Wilmer in an interview for her book As Serious as Your Life, music is a head game, and the idea is that all things that prevent complete absorption of the sound should be cut away as much as possible. For this reason, the lengthy rehearsals required to create the music on unit structures were not spent poring over sheet music. Taylor preferred to dictate sequences of notes to his players and then rework them until the piece achieved its final form. Taylor's album Indent, a solo piano performance, was recorded at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, while he was a professor there. It was initially released on his own Unit Core label in 1973, then reissued by Arista in 1977. The first edition had no liner notes, but the Arista reissue bore two poems, Scroll Number 1 and Scroll Number 2, on its back cover. The two-part poem, originally published in Sound and Fury magazine in 1965, is perhaps Taylor's most explicitly political writing. He paid close attention to politics all his life, but often seemed concerned with racism and homophobia, mostly from the angle that it was just one more obstacle to him achieving the glory and acclaim that was his due. As Kevin Lynch wrote, Taylor's life was lived uphill most of the way, outperforming white men and virtually everyone, to finally gain, as an old man, honors with financial rewards. Uplifting others didn't really enter into it. Still, in this poem, Taylor brandishes vivid images of slavery and oppression, writing, white crucifix, white flame, white God, white hood, and you just sing, dance unseen, crop handler, food maker, lost nobles, chewed spit and grits, shit and molasses, hot smellin', teeth toothless hyena smile. The liner notes to Taylor's 1975 solo album Air Above Mountains are very different from those accompanying the reissue of Indent. They are as insightful as the music is beautiful. Though they're structured as a long poem by Taylor entitled Aquae ar Oyo, a nod to the voodoo god who carries the spirits of the dead to the afterlife, the language is often clear, and a few lines leap out as miniature manifestos. He writes, ability to relate instantly and build concomitant sound structures, improvisation, and technique is weapon to do whatever must be done, and returns to the fundamental creative dictum described earlier, saying, music does not exist within notation, which proceeds from heretical cultural aggrandizement association. Aquae ar Oyo is copyrighted 1973 in the liner notes, and the ideas it expresses seem very clearly connected to what Taylor was trying to get across to his students, and indeed the members of his various units and ensembles, while teaching in Wisconsin, Ohio, and New Jersey. When his words are combined with the music, the full package gives Air Above Mountains the feeling of a manifesto. Taylor wrote another long poem to accompany Embraced, a recording of a controversial duo concert he performed with fellow pianist Mary Lou Williams in 1977. Many attendees felt that their styles did not mesh well at all, and even claimed they were in conflict the entire time they were playing together. But in fact, Taylor was attempting to fuse his own music with Williams' older style, and was more successful than not. In the poem, he engages with issues of style and musical evolution, writing, "Style in itself ringeth a most narrow paradigm genuflecting to the cultural mores of a given time, having as implied fact a temporal sense easily dated and quick to age. The living in music's ongoing development is the memory hand born of the finest tendrils constituting nerve, which fires spirit and plead for representation built from historic accumulation." Taylor's poetry, like his music, evolved throughout his life. In later years, his writing became ever more abstract, concerned with the sound of words in combination more than the meaning of phrases. He would recite long lines that combined scientific terminology with bits of ancient history, but it all seemed to be more about how the words felt and sounded as they passed his lips than about making anything clear to the listener. His lines were full of puns and assonances and repetition, celebrating the pure rapture of speech. Taylor's final live performance at the Whitney Museum in April 2016 concluded with a poem that incorporated natural history, biology, and much more over thousands of words in an attempt to offer a complete catalyzing vision of the world, how it got this way, how it might be improved. If the music from that performance is ever released, I hope the full text of the poem accompanies it.